Maya had always been a quiet girl. She liked simple things, reading books, drawing in her sketchpad, and listening to music on her headphones. She didn't like being in the spotlight, and she never craved attention the way some of her classmates did. For her, peace and privacy were more valuable than being noticed. When she moved to a new school in Los Angeles, she carried that same dream in her heart. She wanted a fresh start, a chance to fit in without anyone pointing fingers or whispering about her. To the world, her last name carried weight. It was tied to red carpets, flashing cameras, and action movies seen by millions. But to her, it was simply her family name, and she wanted to live a normal life like any other teenager. Her father was one of the most famous actors in the world, known for fast cars, daring stunts, and a voice that could command any room. But at home, he wasn't Vin Diesel, the star. To Maya, he was just Dad, the man who tucked her in at night, asked about her homework, and reminded her to eat breakfast before rushing to school. He loved her unconditionally, and he had raised her to believe that she was strong, smart, and capable of achieving anything she set her mind to. Still, Maya knew that people often saw her differently because of who her father was. Friends from her old school sometimes treated her with curiosity, as if being close to her meant being close to fame. Others whispered behind her back, making up stories about her life, guessing at how much money her family had, or wondering what it was like to live in the shadow of a celebrity. She hated that. More than anything, Maya wanted people to see her for who she really was, a regular girl who worked hard, cared deeply, and wanted to belong. On her first morning at the new school, she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair slowly. She wore a simple outfit, jeans, a soft pastel sweater, and white sneakers. Nothing flashy. She wanted to blend in, to look like any other girl walking through the hallways. She slung her backpack over her shoulder, whispered a little prayer for courage, and headed out the door. Her father drove her to school that day. The ride was quiet at first, filled with the sound of the radio humming softly in the background. He glanced at her once or twice, noticing how she nervously tapped her fingers against her leg. "You're going to do great," he said with a warm smile. "Remember, you don't have to be anyone but yourself. That's more than enough." Maya nodded, though her stomach still twisted with butterflies. She trusted his words, but she also knew how hard it could be to walk into a place where everyone already had their own groups, their own circles, and their own first impressions. When they arrived, she gave him a quick hug, stepped out of the car, and took a deep breath. The school building loomed tall, with students scattered across the courtyard. Some laughed with their friends, others rushed to their lockers, and a few stood by the entrance scrolling on their phones. She tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack and walked in, telling herself over and over that she belonged here too. The first few hours passed like a blur. New teachers introduced themselves, classmates exchanged glances, and names floated around the room like confetti. Maya sat quietly in the back, scribbling notes and pretending not to notice when a few curious eyes lingered on her longer than usual. She wondered if they could tell if they saw something familiar in her face, or if they had already guessed who her father was. During lunch, she found a spot at the edge of the cafeteria, away from the loudest groups. She unpacked the sandwich her father had made that morning and scrolled through her phone, pretending to be busy. Every now and then, a burst of laughter would echo from the tables nearby, and she felt the familiar tug of loneliness. She wanted to join, to smile, to make friends, but she was afraid. What if they only liked her because of her last name? What if they judged her before they even got to know her? She had promised herself that she wouldn't tell anyone about her family. Not yet. Not until she found at least one true friend who cared for Maya, not for the girl connected to Hollywood. That evening, when she returned home, her father asked her how the first day went. She gave a small shrug and said, it was okay. She didn't want him to worry. He had always told her that she didn't have to prove herself to anyone, but deep inside, Maya wanted to prove something to herself, that she could make it in this new place without relying on anyone else's fame. As the days went on, she slowly learned her way around the school. She found the art room, which became her favorite spot. The smell of paint and paper felt comforting, like a safe haven where no one cared about last names or family secrets. When she drew, she was free. Each line and shade of color told her own story, one no one else could rewrite. Yet, even as she tried to blend in, Maya couldn't help but notice how different she felt. She was quiet where others were loud, gentle where others were bold. Some classmates barely noticed her, while others gave her long stares, as if trying to figure out the puzzle she represented. She reminded herself each day that being different was not a weakness. Her father had told her countless times, "Your uniqueness is your strength." But in the hallways of high school, surrounded by the noise of gossip and the pressure to fit in, it was hard to believe those words. Still, she kept going. She woke up early, dressed simply, studied hard, and treated everyone with kindness. She didn't want to draw attention. All she wanted was peace, friendship, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was building her own path. What Maya didn't know, however, was that not everyone at her new school would accept her for who she was. And though she tried to keep her head down and live unnoticed, there was always someone watching, someone who would test her patience, her courage, and her ability to rise above cruelty. But for now, she walked through the crowded hallways with her backpack slung tightly, her heart filled with hope that maybe, just maybe, this school could be the fresh start she longed for. The first few weeks at her new school had been a mixture of calm and quiet for Maya. She kept her head down, moved carefully through the hallways, and always chose a seat at the back of her classrooms. She wasn't the kind of person who liked loud entrances or being the center of attention. She wanted to build her new life slowly, without rushing into things, without drawing eyes to herself. Most students had their own groups already. Some had grown up together since elementary school, some bonded through sports, and others through clubs and shared hobbies. Maya felt like a guest in a home that wasn't hers yet. She tried to smile politely, exchange greetings when spoken to, and blend in with the crowd. For the most part, it worked. But there's always someone who notices when someone new is different. Tyler was one of those people. He was the kind of boy who walked through the hallways with confidence, almost as if he owned the place. His friends laughed at everything he said, whether it was funny or not, and his voice always seemed to echo louder than the rest. Teachers often told him to sit down, quiet down, or pay attention, but Tyler had a way of bending rules without breaking them completely. He was smart enough to avoid big trouble, but mischievous enough to always be on the edge of it. When Tyler first saw Maya, she was standing in line at the cafeteria, her tray in her hands, waiting patiently for her turn. There was something about her that made him curious. She wasn't loud, she wasn't trying to impress anyone, and she didn't seem to care about being noticed. To some, that kind of quietness goes unseen. But to someone like Tyler, it stood out. He leaned over to his friends and whispered, just loud enough for them to hear, "Who's the new girl?" His friends shrugged. One of them said, "She doesn't really talk much." Another added, "Yeah, she always eats by herself." That was enough for Tyler to set his eyes on her. He wasn't used to people ignoring him, and Maya seemed like someone who wouldn't fight back if he teased her. He saw her kindness as softness, and her silence as weakness. What he didn't realize was that Maya's silence wasn't weakness at all, it was strength, but the kind of strength that doesn't shout or demand attention. The first time he spoke to her was during lunch. She had just sat down at a table in the corner, unwrapping her sandwich, when Tyler and his friends walked by. He slowed his pace, looked at her, and with a smirk said, "Hey, don't you get lonely sitting here all by yourself?" His friends chuckled, waiting to see her reaction. Maya looked up briefly, gave a polite smile, and said softly, "I'm fine, thank you." Then she went back to her food. Her calm reply didn't give Tyler the reaction he wanted. He was expecting her to blush, to stutter, or to look embarrassed. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, and that annoyed him more than he wanted to admit. Over the next few days, Tyler found small ways to test her. Sometimes he made unnecessary comments when she passed by in the hallway. Other times he would mimic the way she walked or whisper jokes to his friends when Maya answered a question in class. The comments weren't loud enough for teachers to hear, but just enough for Maya to notice. Maya felt the sting of his attention but tried to ignore it. She remembered her father's advice, "Not everyone who looks at you deserves your energy. Choose wisely who you give your peace to." She wanted to believe that ignoring Tyler would make him lose interest, but deep down she could sense that his curiosity was only growing stronger. One Friday afternoon, during gym class, the students were divided into teams for basketball. Maya wasn't very competitive, but she played with quiet effort, passing the ball and doing her best to help her team. Tyler ended up on the opposite side, and from the very beginning, he treated the game like a performance. He dribbled dramatically, called out plays that weren't real, and made sure everyone's eyes were on him. When Maya accidentally stole the ball from him and passed it to her teammate, leading to a score, Tyler's grin faltered. His friends laughed at him in good fun, but he didn't take it lightly. For the rest of the game, he made sure to block her every move, shadowing her across the court. At one point, he leaned down and whispered, "You think you're better than me?" Maya, slightly out of breath, shook her head and said, "No, I'm just playing the game." Her honesty only deepened his irritation. To him, it felt like she was brushing him off again. To her, it was just the truth. By the time the final whistle blew, Tyler had already decided that Maya wasn't just another quiet student. She was different. She didn't react the way others did, and that made him even more determined to push her buttons. Over the next week, his comments became sharper, though still hidden behind the mask of just joking. When Maya answered a question in history class, Tyler muttered under his breath, "Teacher's favorite." When she walked past him in the hallway, he made little remarks to his friends like, "There she goes, Miss Quiet." Maya's heart would sink each time, but she refused to let him see her hurt. She carried herself with grace, telling herself that kindness was stronger than cruelty. Still, it wasn't easy. There were nights she sat at her desk at home, staring at her homework, wondering why some people found joy in making others feel small. Her father noticed the change in her mood one evening. She was unusually quiet at dinner, pushing her food around on her plate. He asked gently, "Is everything all right at school?" Maya gave a small nod and said, "It's fine." She didn't want him to worry, and she didn't want to seem weak. She believed she could handle it on her own. But deep inside, the little remarks were starting to build a wall inside her heart. She wanted so badly to prove that she could face challenges without running to her father's shadow. She wanted to win this battle with patience and self-control. Tyler, however, wasn't planning to stop. To him, Maya's calmness wasn't a shield, it was a challenge. He thought if he kept pushing, eventually she would break, and he would get the reaction he craved. What he didn't know was that Maya had more resilience than he imagined. And what he truly didn't know, what would soon change everything, was who Maya's father really was. The cafeteria was always the loudest place in the school. Trays clattered against tables, laughter spilled out from every corner, and the smell of pizza and fries floated through the air. For most students, lunch was a time to relax, to chat, to catch up with friends. But for Maya, it was a test she faced every day. She carried her tray carefully, scanning the room for a quiet place where she could sit unnoticed. She found comfort in corners, near the windows, or at the far ends of tables where no one else wanted to sit. On this particular afternoon, she chose a small table near the side wall. She placed her tray down, opened her lunch, and began eating slowly. She kept her eyes on her food, hoping the noise of the room would drown out the thoughts swirling in her head. She wanted peace, just a few moments of calm before returning to the next class. But peace rarely lasts when someone is determined to disturb it. Tyler entered the cafeteria with his usual energy, his friends trailing behind him. He walked as if he expected the whole room to notice him, tossing his backpack onto a chair and scanning the tables. His eyes landed on Maya almost instantly. There she was, sitting quietly, just as she always did. Something about her silence seemed to challenge him, though Maya never meant for it to. He whispered something to his friends, and they laughed. Then, with a smirk, he made his way toward her table. Maya felt his presence before he even spoke. She looked up briefly, meeting his eyes for only a second, then lowered her gaze back to her food. "Look who's sitting all by herself again," Tyler said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Don't you ever get tired of eating alone?" A few students glanced in their direction, curious to see what would happen. Maya's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm fine here, thank you," she replied softly. Her calm response might have ended things, but Tyler wasn't satisfied. He leaned against the edge of her table, tilting his head as if studying her. "You act like you don't care. But everyone notices, you know. You're always so quiet. It's kind of weird." Maya's hands tightened around her sandwich, but she didn't speak. She had learned that sometimes silence was stronger than words. But Tyler mistook her silence for weakness. The room seemed to hush just slightly, as if people were waiting to see what would happen next. Tyler smiled wider, sensing the attention. He pointed to the empty chairs around her. "See? No one even wants to sit with you. Isn't that sad?" A soft ripple of laughter moved through a nearby table. Maya felt her cheeks grow warm, but she kept her eyes on her tray. She told herself not to let his words sink into her heart. She told herself to stay strong. But Tyler didn't stop. He straightened up, raised his voice a little more, and said, "Maybe if you actually talked to people, you wouldn't be invisible all the time." This time, the cafeteria grew noticeably quieter. Students nearby stopped mid-bite, some lowering their voices to whispers. A few pulled out their phones, curious if this moment might become something worth recording. Maya could feel dozens of eyes on her, and suddenly, the room felt like it was closing in. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to vanish from that table, from that cafeteria, from that very moment. But she couldn't. She was there, sitting under the weight of every stare, while Tyler stood over her like he had won something. Her hands trembled slightly, and she pushed her tray aside. She rose from her chair slowly, her head held as high as she could manage. She looked at him for a brief moment, not with anger, not with hatred, but with quiet disappointment. Then, without a word, she picked up her backpack and walked out of the cafeteria. The silence that followed her steps was louder than anything Tyler had said. For a moment, the room felt frozen. Then whispers began to spread. Some students shook their heads, others giggled nervously, and a few recorded her leaving, already thinking about posting it online. Maya walked quickly down the hallway, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She reached the girls' restroom, pushed the door open, and slipped inside. Leaning against the sink, she finally let out the breath she had been holding. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror. She saw her own eyes glistening, not from anger but from hurt. She had promised herself she wouldn't let anyone's words control her, but she couldn't deny the ache inside her chest. She wasn't upset because she was alone at lunch. She was upset because someone had turned her quietness into a stage for mockery. She pressed her palms against the cool surface of the sink and whispered to herself, "You're stronger than this." She repeated it again and again, like a gentle chant, until her breathing began to steady. Meanwhile, back in the cafeteria, the video of what had just happened was already making its way through the school. Students replayed it, shared it, and sent it to friends. By the end of the day, almost everyone had seen it. Some felt sympathy for Maya, others simply treated it as entertainment, and a few even admired the way she had walked out without saying a word. Tyler, however, wore a grin as he scrolled through his phone. He thought he had won. He thought he had shown everyone that the quiet girl wasn't so untouchable after all. He didn't realize that his actions had crossed a line, and that the quiet dignity Maya carried with her was more powerful than the loud laughter he relied on. When Maya returned home that evening, her father noticed her unusual silence. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her notebook but not writing anything. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and asked, "Rough day?" She hesitated, then nodded. She didn't want to tell him everything, but she also knew she couldn't hide forever. "Some people at school, they don't understand me," she said softly. He looked at her carefully, reading the weight behind her words. He didn't push her for details, but his eyes carried the promise that he was there for her, no matter what. That night, as Maya lay in bed, her phone buzzed with notifications. She opened it and saw the video her walking out of the cafeteria, her face set with quiet strength while the room watched. Her chest tightened, but then she noticed something surprising. Among the comments, a few students had written, "She's so strong," and, "I would have cried," but she didn't even flinch. For the first time, Maya realized that her silence had spoken louder than Tyler's words. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't argued, she hadn't given him the reaction he wanted. She had simply walked away, and that had made an impression none of them could ignore. Still, she knew this wasn't the end. Tyler wasn't finished, and the whispers at school wouldn't disappear overnight. But she also knew one thing for certain: she was stronger than she had felt in that moment, and her story wasn't defined by the actions of one person. What she didn't know was that this moment, the cafeteria, the video, the whispers, was only the beginning of something much larger. Because soon, the truth about who she really was would come to light, and the boy who thought he had power over her would discover just how wrong he had been. The weekend after the cafeteria incident felt unusually long for Maya. She stayed in her room most of the time, sketching in her notebook and listening to music, trying to push away the memory of Tyler's loud words and the way everyone's eyes had turned to her. The video was still spreading online, but she avoided it. She didn't want to see herself through the lens of gossip. Her father noticed her silence. He had always been tuned into her emotions, even when she tried to hide them. On Saturday evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he spoke gently. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said, "but I can see something is weighing on you." Maya glanced at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. After a pause, she whispered, "It's just, people at school don't understand me. They make me feel like being quiet means I don't belong." He reached for her hand and gave it a squeeze. "Being quiet doesn't make you less. It makes you strong in your own way. And if someone doesn't see that, it says more about them than about you." His words comforted her, but she still carried the ache of that moment in the cafeteria. She wanted to believe his encouragement, but she couldn't forget the way everyone had stared, as if she were some kind of spectacle. By Monday morning, the situation at school had grown. The video wasn't just a passing moment anymore, it was a topic of conversation in classrooms, hallways, and even online groups. Some students supported Maya, praising her calm reaction. Others repeated Tyler's comments, adding their own jokes. And then there were those who simply stayed silent, unsure of what to think. Tyler, however, walked into school with his usual confidence. He thought the whole situation had made him look clever, like he had proven his point. He didn't realize how quickly things could turn. At lunch that day, Maya sat at her usual quiet table. She knew people were watching her, but she kept her focus on her food. She didn't want to give anyone more reason to talk. Suddenly, a murmur spread through the cafeteria. Heads turned toward the entrance, whispers growing louder by the second. Maya looked up, confused, until she saw him, her father. Vin Diesel walked into the room, dressed simply in jeans and a plain t-shirt, yet his presence filled the space. Students gasped, some pulling out their phones immediately, others whispering in disbelief. Teachers hurried forward, surprised but respectful, unsure of why he was there. Maya's heart leapt into her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't told him everything, yet somehow he knew enough to come. For a moment, she didn't know whether to feel relieved or embarrassed. Tyler froze at his table, his confident grin slipping away. He had seen celebrities on screens, but he never imagined one would be standing in his school cafeteria, especially not because of something he had done. Vin Diesel's eyes scanned the room, calm but steady, until they landed on Maya. He walked toward her slowly, and the crowd parted like waves. When he reached her, he placed a hand on her shoulder, and the warmth of his touch told her everything she needed to know. He was there for her, fully and completely. The cafeteria was silent now, every student watching. Vin turned to face the room, his deep voice carrying without effort. "I came here today as a father," he began. "Not as an actor, not as someone on a screen. Just as a father who cares about his daughter." The room remained still. Even the teachers stood quietly, listening. He continued, his tone steady but filled with emotion. "Sometimes in life, people think being loud makes them strong. They think making fun of others makes them powerful. But the truth is, real strength comes from kindness. Real strength is choosing to lift someone up instead of pushing them down." Maya lowered her eyes, her cheeks warm, but she felt a swell of pride in her chest. Her father wasn't here to embarrass her. He was here to protect her dignity and remind everyone that words mattered. Vin glanced around the room, his eyes sharp but not angry. "I've raised my daughter to know that she is enough just as she is. Quiet or loud, tall or small, no one has the right to make her feel less than who she is." Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His friends avoided his eyes. The weight of Vin's words hung in the air like a lesson that couldn't be ignored. One student at the back whispered, "That's his daughter," and the words rippled through the cafeteria. Slowly, realization dawned on everyone. Maya wasn't just the quiet girl who ate alone. She was the daughter of a man admired by millions. But more importantly, she was someone whose worth had nothing to do with fame, and everything to do with who she was as a person. Vin placed his hand gently on Maya's shoulder once more. "You don't have to be known by who your family is," he said, looking directly at her. "You're already special because you're you. Don't ever forget that." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't filled with mockery or judgment. It was filled with respect, reflection, and a little bit of awe. After a moment, Vin gave a small nod to the teachers, then leaned down and whispered something to Maya. She nodded back, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Together, they walked out of the cafeteria, leaving behind a room full of students who would never forget what had just happened. That evening, the story spread beyond the school. Pictures and videos of Vin Diesel standing in the cafeteria with Maya circulated online. But unlike the first video, this one carried a very different message. People shared it with captions like, "A father's love," and, "This is what standing up for family looks like." Maya scrolled through the comments, surprised by the positivity. For once, the spotlight didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a shield, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Tyler, on the other hand, found himself at the center of whispers for the first time. His friends weren't laughing with him anymore. Instead, they asked why he had thought it was okay to treat Maya the way he did. Teachers kept a closer eye on him, and students who once admired his confidence now saw it differently. He began to realize that his words had consequences, and that making someone else feel small didn't make him bigger. For Maya, life at school didn't suddenly become perfect. She still liked her quiet lunches and her sketchbook sessions in the art room. But now, when people looked at her, it wasn't with ridicule. It was with respect. Some even offered her kind smiles or small nods in the hallway. A few brave classmates sat with her at lunch, not because of who her father was, but because they had seen her strength. And though she hadn't wanted her father to step into her school life, she understood now why he had done it. He hadn't come as a movie star. He had come as her dad. And sometimes, that was the greatest kind of hero anyone could have. The next morning, when Maya walked through the school gates, the air felt different. She noticed it in the way people looked at her, not with judgment, not with curiosity, but with a softer kind of respect. Some students offered her small smiles, others gave her nods, and even those who didn't speak to her seemed to carry a new awareness in their eyes. For the first time since she arrived, Maya didn't feel invisible. As she moved through the hallway, she could hear whispers, but they weren't sharp like before. They were filled with wonder. "That's her," one student said quietly. "She's the one." Another replied, "I saw the video, she's amazing." It was strange for Maya to be the center of attention, but this time it didn't sting. It didn't feel like mockery. Instead, it felt like her quiet strength had finally been noticed. In her first class of the day, she sat down as usual, pulling out her notebook. A girl she recognized from the art club slid into the seat beside her. "Hey," the girl said softly, "I just wanted to say I thought you were really brave yesterday." Maya blinked in surprise, then gave a small smile. "Thank you," she whispered back. That small moment was like a spark of warmth in her chest. For so long, she had wondered if anyone saw her for who she really was. Now, little by little, it seemed they did. Meanwhile, Tyler wasn't walking with his usual swagger anymore. The cafeteria incident with Vin Diesel had left a mark on him. Students no longer laughed at his comments the way they once did. Instead, they looked at him with questioning eyes, as if silently asking, "Why did you do that?" Even his closest friends were quieter around him, not rushing to echo his jokes. For the first time, Tyler felt what it was like to be on the outside of the laughter, and he didn't like it. He realized that the attention he used to crave wasn't worth much if it was built on making someone else feel small. Later that week, Maya was surprised when Tyler approached her. It was after school, in the courtyard, when most students were heading home. She saw him coming and felt her shoulders tense, but his face didn't hold the same smirk it usually did. Instead, he looked nervous, almost uncertain. "Hey," he said quietly, stopping a few feet away. I wanted to say sorry." Maya tilted her head, unsure of what to say. She studied him for a moment. His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it, and his eyes didn't hold the usual spark of mischief. "I was wrong," he continued. "I thought it was funny at the time, but it wasn't. I didn't think about how it made you feel. And I didn't know, about your dad." He hesitated, then added, "But that doesn't matter. Even without that, I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." Maya let his words sink in. Part of her still remembered the sting of his teasing, the way it had made her feel so small in front of everyone. But another part of her saw the change in his eyes, the sincerity in his tone. She took a slow breath and replied, "Thank you for saying that. I don't want to be treated differently because of who my father is. I just want to be treated with respect, like anyone else." Tyler nodded, his shoulders dropping with relief. "Yeah. I get it now." It wasn't an instant friendship, and Maya didn't expect it to be. But in that moment, something shifted. Tyler had learned a lesson he would carry with him for a long time: kindness mattered more than popularity, and respect mattered more than attention. As weeks passed, Maya's life at school began to feel lighter. She still enjoyed her quiet lunches, but now she was rarely alone. A few classmates started joining her, curious to know more about the girl who carried herself with such grace. They discovered her love for art, her gentle humor, and her thoughtful way of listening. Slowly, she built connections not because of her father's fame, but because of her own heart. Her teachers noticed the change too. Maya raised her hand more often in class, her voice steady and clear. She no longer worried about whispers when she spoke. She had faced the hardest moment in the cafeteria and had walked through it with dignity. That memory gave her strength every time she felt unsure. One afternoon, during art club, the teacher asked the students to create a piece that represented strength. Maya sat quietly, her pencil moving across the page. She drew a tree, its roots deep in the ground, its branches reaching high toward the sky. Around it, winds swirled and storms raged, but the tree stood firm. It was her story in a single image, quiet, steady, unshaken by noise. When her classmates saw it, they nodded with admiration. One of them said softly, "That's beautiful. That's you." At home, her father continued to remind her that he was proud. He never once regretted walking into that cafeteria. "You didn't need me to prove your strength," he told her one evening as they washed dishes together. "But sometimes, even the strongest people deserve someone to stand by their side." Maya smiled at him, feeling the truth of his words. She had learned that strength wasn't about never needing help, it was about knowing who you were, even when the world tried to shake you. By the end of the school year, Maya had grown into herself in ways she never expected. She was still quiet, still thoughtful, still happiest with a sketchbook in hand. But she was no longer invisible. She was seen, respected, and, most importantly, understood. Tyler, too, had changed. He never returned to his old ways of teasing. Instead, he carried a quieter presence, as if the lesson of that day had softened something in him. He no longer sought attention by putting others down. Instead, he began to find it in more positive ways, helping out in class, joining the school sports team with more focus, and even offering small kindnesses when no one expected it. For the students who witnessed everything, the memory of that year lingered. They would always remember the day when a quiet girl walked out of the cafeteria with dignity, and the day when a father reminded them all what true strength looked like. As for Maya, she carried those lessons with her wherever she went. She learned that her worth didn't depend on what others said, and that sometimes silence could speak louder than words. She discovered that courage wasn't always loud, it was often steady, calm, and unshaken. Years later, when she looked back on her school days, she didn't remember the sting of Tyler's words as much as she remembered the love that carried her through, the love of her father, the kindness of new friends, and the strength she found within herself. And for everyone who had watched her story unfold, the lesson remained clear: true respect is earned not by fame, not by force, but by dignity, kindness, and the courage to stay true to who you are.